All right, let's jump right in. We are embarking on a truly massive historical journey today. This explainer is a grand saga charting over a millennium of Russian history. We're going to map out its shifting regimes, the dramatic, almost whiplash-inducing rise and fall of its leaders through the centuries, and of course, its relentless geographic expansion. Now, to really wrap our heads around this grand saga, we first need to grasp the sheer modern scale of the place. Today, Russia spans an incredible 11 time zones. It stretches over 5,600 miles, literally all the way from the small enclave of Kaliningrad in the west, straight across to Big Diomede Island in the east. And this brilliantly illustrates just how vast we're talking. Russia is so massive that Canada, which remember is the second biggest nation on Earth, could fit inside its borders over 1.7 times. It's an absolutely staggering scale. And Russia has actually held the title of the world's largest country for well over 300 years. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap to see how they pulled that off. We'll cover the scale of Russia, the era of princes, Vikings, and Mongols, track the rise of the Tsars and their imperial zenith, before finally looking at the rise of the Soviets and the communist collapse. Part 1. The scale of Russia. Before there was ever a unified state, the immense Pontic-Caspian steppe, situated just west of the Ural Mountains, was simply home to a diverse array of Indo-European and Germanic tribes. Moving right along to Part 2, Princes, Vikings, and Mongols. Fast forward to the 9th and 10th centuries. Scandinavian Norsemen basically sailed down these vast river networks, settling down and assimilating to form independent city-states like Kiev and Novgorod. But that early prosperity didn't last. These Rus city-states were thriving on trade until 1223, when a massive new threat arrived from the east, the Mongols. By 1240, nomadic horsemen under Genghis Khan's successors had completely razed Kiev to the ground, subjugating the entire region to the Golden Horde for 2 centuries. Actually, it wasn't until the Mongol decline in the 15th century that a new local power, the Duchy of Muscovy, finally stepped up to fill that power vacuum. That perfectly sets up Part 3, Rise of the Tsars. Leaders like Ivan III managed to centralize power, which laid the exact groundwork for his grandson, Ivan IV, to be crowned the very first Tsar of all Russia in 1547. And man, that kicked off a relentless outward push. Now, what's really interesting about this is how these autocrats had completely distinct geographic visions that fundamentally reshaped the map. You had Ivan the Terrible pushing strictly eastward over the Urals into Siberia. Later on, Peter the Great looked west, fighting prolonged wars with Sweden to secure Baltic warm water ports and build St. Petersburg. And then, in the late 18th century, Catherine the Great drove Russian powers south, securing the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire. But to fully grasp that massive eastern expansion started by Ivan, we've got to talk about the Cossacks. These were semi-nomadic horsemen from the steppe. Russian authorities literally hired these highly skilled, rugged fighters to probe and conquer the vast unknown territories stretching eastward. And their progress was blazing fast. The Cossacks first conquered the Sibir Khanate, and within a century, Russian explorers had already reached the Kamchatka Peninsula on the Pacific Ocean. By 1733, a Danish captain named Vitus Bering was commissioned to explore the Pacific. That eventually led fur trappers to cross the ocean and claim the coastlines of Alaska for Russia in 1741. Which brings us to Part 4, the Imperial Zenith. Moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, the Russian Empire was at the absolute height of its power. Catherine the Great capitalized on the declining Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, securing extensive new territories, including modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. And you know what? That immense size became their greatest weapon. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded back in 1812, Russia was the only continental power able to successfully repel him. They literally weaponized the sheer geographic bulk of their territory, plus the brutal harshness of the Russian winter, to completely decimate the invading French army. But, as you can imagine, managing an empire of this unimaginable scale is a massive headache. So in 1867, Russia decided to pivot its strategic interests toward Central Asia. To fund this, the empire made a genuinely surprising move. They sold their immense Alaskan landholdings to the United States for a modest sum of just $7.2 million. Crazy to think about now, right? So this pivot towards Central Asia triggered a huge imperial rivalry known as the Great Game.
See, Britain was terrified that Russia's continuing expansion southward was going to threaten their colonial interests in India. This sparked an intense diplomatic and military contest over buffer states. It got so severe that European powers actually united in 1878 at the Congress of Berlin, specifically to halt any further Russian advances in the Balkans.
Part 5. Rise of the Soviets. On paper, the Russian Empire was at its absolute territorial peak, but the reality? The regime was rotting from the inside out. You had this stark, glaring contrast in the late 19th century. On one hand, a vast, unmatched territorial power, but on the other, an impoverished, backward economy. Compared to Western Europe, Russia was just failing to modernize. That severe economic struggle, combined with a deeply rigid Tsarist political system, brewed a tense atmosphere that heavily fueled radical revolutionary movements.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because the disastrous years of the First World War were the final straw. In 1917, communists under Vladimir Lenin launched a revolution. This triggered a bitter civil war, culminating in the emergence of the USSR in 1923. Decades later, following the immense losses and eventual victories of World War II, the Soviet regime aggressively expanded its buffer zone once again, establishing a sphere of vassal states all across Eastern Europe.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 6, the Communist Collapse. The map of Russia was about to undergo one of its most rapid and dramatic transformations yet, as we enter the Cold War era. Throughout the Cold War, the USSR kept heavily projecting its power across the globe. They supported communist regimes far beyond their borders, places like North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, and Afghanistan. But while they were projecting this immense power abroad, at home, the state was suffocating. The Soviet system was completely failing to innovate, and its economy was stagnating. By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union had fallen dramatically behind Western powers. The damage was already done, and in many ways irreversible. Even when Mikhail Gorbachev attempted sweeping reforms to save the system, it was simply too little too late. The structural rot was terminal. And so, the entire edifice of communism collapsed. Over the course of 1990 and 1991, the USSR completely dissolved. A massive wave of states broke away from Moscow. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, the Central Asian nations, and the Caucasus republics. In the blink of an eye, historically speaking, the map violently shrank back down, leaving us with the modern Russian Federation we know today. Which leaves us with a really profound question to ponder. How will Russia's 1,000-year cycle of expanding empires and collapsing regimes influence its future on the global stage? We've seen tribes become city-states fall to Mongols, Tsars conquer continents, and a sprawling Soviet empire dissolve almost overnight. This grand saga of changing maps and dramatic leadership shifts isn't just history, it's the very foundation of our modern world. Keep that in mind as you look at geopolitics today. Thanks for joining.